all of that out of the way, welcome to EREF Science Session, exploring the impacts of climate change on the solid waste industry. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Dr. Suzie Boxman. I'm the Director of Programs at the Environmental Research and Education Foundation. I have two fantastic speakers joining me today to discuss this important topic. I'm going to introduce them now. So first is Kristian Macoskey, who is a qualified environmental professional with over 37 years of air quality consulting experience. Chris currently leads CEC's ESG sustainability team, and in that capacity, he provides ESG strategy, greenhouse gas emission inventory, decarbonization planning, climate change risk assessment, and ESG reporting services. He's also leading the development and implementation of CEC's corporate ESG strategy. I also have Annette Synowiec, who is the Director of Policy, Planning and Outreach in the Solid Waste Management Services Division of the City of Toronto. As part of its long-term waste management strategy, the City of Toronto is working towards an aspirational goal of zero waste and circular economy. She is also the current president of the Ontario chapter of the Solid Waste Association of North America. Thank you both for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
So to kind of kick things off today, the first thing we thought would be good to cover and talk about a little bit are, get us oriented to climate change and some of the potential impacts of climate change. So when we are talking about that, and when we're talking about it during the webinar today, what exactly are we discussing? So overall, we're looking at, on this slide, you can see some impacts of climate change. This is not a comprehensive list of either impacts or associated outcomes of those potential impacts. But for example, some of the things that we're thinking about when we're talking about climate change and its potential impacts on the solid waste industry include increasing average temperatures. So that's definitely something we're seeing across the Southeast US and Western US and other places in the world. I know we're experiencing increased average temperatures right now, and some potential impacts of those could be stresses on infrastructure, a lot of power demand, running ACs a lot in those higher temperatures. Another potential impact are more extreme weather events, changing rainfall patterns, changes in water resources. All of these can potentially have big impacts on food supply, distribution. It can cause food reduction if crops are stressed and unable to produce as much food. Drought and water scarcity from all of those different climatic impacts. Increased flooding, I know, is something that also is a big impact to solid waste infrastructure. Sea level rise and ecosystem change are kind of the last two impacts on my list. Thinking about ecosystem change, that could be causing more vermin and insects, and I think that is something Annette mentioned that they are seeing on the ground. And overall these impacts, I know something that's been impacting us recently here in Raleigh, health impacts from air quality issues associated with fires is definitely a new one for some of us in the Southeast. So, when we're thinking about climate change, here are kind of a basic list of the impacts and potential outcomes. But that really leads me to asking you, Annette, with your experience in the City of Toronto, what are you seeing as some example outcomes that are impacting the solid waste industry for you?
Thanks, Suzie. So the one example I wanted to provide is one that is happening really recently, and I think was also experienced in areas of the US. So, we saw definite impacts to air quality in the Toronto area and beyond as a result of the Canadian wildfires. And that really is something that we have not experienced before. So I can say, we've definitely heard about, more of the Western fires maybe taking place in BC or other places of the US on the Western coast, but nothing on the Eastern coast that we've experienced this significance to date. And so I did just a quick search, and how does this event of wildfires kind of relate back to the issue of climate change? And you can see that quote there that, with every increase in temperature, then there's an associated risk of lightning. So, if we are not experiencing rainfall and making sure that, that there's forests that are able to kind of manage those types of events, then it can definitely lead to this. And in Toronto specifically, like, we had to quickly mobilize and actually create a guideline for how to respond to such poor air quality and how did that relate to our operations outside. So specifically, we have some automated collection. So for those workers, they were able to stay in their cabs and be in an air conditioned environment, but there's still some manual collection. So, for those workers, we had to make sure that they were stayed hydrated. They slowed down some of their work. For example, for leaf and yard waste collection, it's still a manual operation, and make sure that they're provided with N95s as well. So additional respiratory PPE. So definitely something, again, we hadn't experienced before to this degree. And again, you can see a shot there of Toronto, and you could smell the smoke in the air. And again, I think that a lot of people on the call probably had, those experiences as well.
Yeah, wow. Well, and that's a lot. Worker safety is definitely one of the bigger issues when we're talking about some of these risks to the solid waste sector of how are we going to make sure that people are safe with air quality issues, and that's a great example of that. So, that's kind of on the ground what people are seeing. But Chris, I was really curious to hear more from your experience with climate change risk assessment. What are you thinking about when you were talking about examples of climate related risk?
Sure. Thanks, Suzie. Well, just to build on what Annette was talking about and things that we're hearing in the news, of course, right now is extreme heat. If you think of this IPCC risk model, one of the hazards that we're talking about then is extreme heat. And you have to think about two other variables that contribute to the kind of combination of a risk. Is the population vulnerable to the extreme heat, and are they exposed? So what's their tolerance or susceptibility to the exposure? That's the vulnerability. And are they in an area where the event is occurring? So are they in the Southwest, for instance, right now, where I think I saw today was 117 degrees in Phoenix yesterday. Those three elements together contribute to our risk, which is a probability or a likelihood of an outcome, a chance, when we talk about risk evaluations. And the impact then is what actually occurred based on that combination of variables. And as shown in this model, on the left side, you're seeing climate-related events pointing toward the center propeller, meaning there's natural variability in climate, and then there are the anthropogenic things that we're talking about as driving change. And then on the right-hand side, there are socioeconomic, or what's often referred to, and the ones on the left we call physical risks and impacts, and then on the right, the socioeconomic is more like the transition to a low carbon economy, the impacts of transitioning. And so we can talk about some of the examples of that, but combined, they generate risk. And even an additional layer of that is the behavior of humans, our responses. There's another model, if you want to flip to, I think I have another slide to share, where more recent thinking is saying, well, we need to account for how humans behave in response to these potential risks and then impacts, because our behavior might have a consequent, cause additional risk. One example could be like because of sea level rise or drought, people may migrate, and that migration can have impacts and consequences to infrastructure and socioeconomic ability to support and food supplies and all kinds of, and waste disposal, and all sorts of combined effects. So those are just some of the things that we think about from a risk perspective. You know, we talk about acute risks, which are, you know, short duration, generally speaking, versus chronic. And we also talk about upstream versus downstream. It's not just a particular facility or system that we look at, like a municipality or a specific landfill, but also the value chain that supports that specific system, both upstream and downstream.
So Chris, actually I had a follow-up on that then. When you're talking about behavior and behavior change, in your example, migration is kind of like a bigger, well, more societal behavior change to an extent. Does that also kind of encompass individual behavior change, like, you know, like Annette's example of providing masks to employees in terms of protecting them from smoke? Or, you know, how broadly does behavior change potentially impact risk assessment?
Yeah, so in the category of transition risks, we do look at things like consumer behavior. And if you think about from a waste perspective, say the emphasis on reducing waste, which will have consequent benefits to reducing energy use and therefore greenhouse gas emissions, for instance. Anything we save or do better at using, you know, we've been talking about energy efficiency since the 70s in buildings, and still a long ways to go, I think. But any way we can conserve resources and energy, we reduce our impacts. And consumers are making decisions about recycling and using less, and society is moving toward, you know, reducing dependence on single-use plastics and all sorts of behavior changes like that go down to the individual level.
Well, and so in talking about risks, Annette, are there other risks kind of that beyond what Chris has mentioned that you were seeing and think would be important to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, I wanted to riff off of Chris's point on migration. So, you know, definitely we do see a lot of new residents coming into the city. And so I think to the behavior change standpoint, you know, we already have you know, goals and initiatives to ensure that our residents are currently educated on our waste diversion programs, which includes organics diversion, which is you know, a possibility to reduce methane emissions in landfill. So, you know, just thinking about you know, new residents that are coming into Canada or into the city, making sure that they have you know, the proper education and supports to participate properly in the city's waste diversion program. So some of the things that we do actually is we go to out into the public and we participate in things like newcomer days and things like that, so that we're actually being able to connect with some of those new residents. But some of the system risks that I wanted to highlight here, again, it's, you know, in looking at it from an integrated waste management system approach, I think you can probably, you know, find examples in all of kind of the cycle there. But the three that I wanted to focus on is, again, programs and education. So a little bit different than the behavior change related to, you know, programs and services for new residents. But if we have climate-related events in some of the instances, like you mentioned, whether it be power loss or floods or things like that, then there's an immediate need for an emergency response or some kind of, you know, incident level response that needs to be done and undertaken right away in the city. So for example, if there's areas that are prone to flooding, you know, in Toronto and in Ontario, we have basements, that's happening a lot. So, you know, those materials now have to be put out to the curb. So they don't have any reuse potential. That's going to go straight to the landfill. You know, the sewer's backed up. There's no way to really rescue or kind of divert those materials. And then on the organic side, Again, if the power goes out for a prolonged period of time, we don't have that food being able to be edible anymore, right? So that has to go to our green bin program. And are people going to take the extra steps that are needed to, go through every single thing in the fridge and remove the food, contents into the green bin and then, properly prepare the recyclables? I don't know, right? So I think that's a challenge sometimes, and you just have to get rid of that material. So again, the opportunity to have had that material properly sorted into different waste streams kind of, is not the priority necessarily when it's an incident level response. The next kind of point along the cycle there I wanted to touch upon is processing. So in the City of Toronto, we have our green bin or organics material that's processed by anaerobic digesters. So they're, again, with climate-related impacts, we'd have to think about, the variability in temperature to ensure that those digestion tanks are maintained at a consistent temperature to operate optimally. And if that temperature is more variable, then there's going to be a lot more controls and monitoring needed, and ultimately, scoping required in future contracts to operate and maintain those facilities, and maybe extra power to make sure that the temperature is kind of maintained at a consistent level for optimum gas production. So, and then finally, the last point I wanted to touch upon is disposal. So again, extreme weather events like increased precipitation. So we would have to manage any of that leachate that would be collected from the landfill. So we might have had an existing design of our stormwater ponds or leachate management and water treatment systems. But if we're starting to see these peaks in the amount of volume of water that needs to be managed or retained and treated prior to release into the natural environment, you might have to design that at, much more than what you originally had to, for your kind of design capacity. So a couple of different kind of applications there that we'd have to see.
Mm-hmm. Well, so continuing this discussion, kind of thinking about risks, Chris, could you explain more about what you mean by a climate-related disclosure?
Sure. So when I think about climate disclosure, it's generally a voluntary approach to presenting to the public, or from a private corporation perspective, publicly traded for that matter, even more so. But from a corporate perspective, disclosing to your stakeholders the potential risks and opportunities associated with climate change and how they affect your business. Essentially boiling it down to the bottom line from a financial perspective. Although not all disclosures, require a financial assessment, and there have been some disclosure frameworks out there for a while, like the CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, that's had a questionnaire for climate-related disclosure for quite some time, and it contains questions about potential risks to your organization. This model here is from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, who's really been at the forefront for structuring an approach to disclosure. And the assessment of risks really is addressed within this second sphere there from the outside, the strategy piece, where, as it says, you're looking at the actual and potential impacts of these risks to your business operations and financial and so on. And then, the organization, and so as I mentioned, there are different frameworks, and one of the frameworks that's been discussed a lot in the US is the Security and Exchange Commission has proposed new guidelines as of last spring, still being discussed and debated and commented on, possibly something coming out later this fall, that structure a disclosure process and codify it with specific expectations, because heretofore it's all been voluntary. And companies have been disclosing information on their corporate websites through their sustainability reports that doesn't necessarily line up with what they're saying in their formal 10K financial disclosures to their shareholders, and that disconnect was recognized, and the SEC sent letters around to a lot of major corporations saying, hey, you know, we're seeing this doesn't quite line up. Can you comment on that? And ultimately they came out with, well, this proposed rule to try to structure that disclosure process and establish some rules for doing that.
And so are you, you know, mostly seeing this in the context of publicly traded companies who are doing these sorts of disclosures?
Well, so some background noise, but so there's two categories of that we're looking at, both the public corporations who are looking to disclose this information to their shareholders through these, you know, their corporate sustainability reports or their annual TSDF filings and so on. But there's also a body of risk assessment that's needed by project developers, especially those projects that are likely to generate large quantities of CO2 emissions, in order to get financial backing from investors, because investors want to ensure that they're not going to have some liability associated with a project that may not be able to meet its pro forma because it's emitting a lot of emissions, a lot of CO2, and maybe some of these transition impacts could affect its performance and its ability to perform as planned.
So Chris, I think we are getting a lot of feedback from you. Do you mind muting in between? I'm not quite sure where it's coming from. All right. Sorry about that. Well, so maybe it's not Chris, but let's keep moving. So I think one of the other things that you briefly just talked about, you talked about the TCFD risks. Is there more that you think would be that you'd like to highlight on the TCFD risks? I think if you just keep talking, it was okay. You're still muted.
There, now I'm unmuted. I wasn't able to unmute myself. Sorry. So yeah, from the TCFD perspective, we had that structure with the interlocking circles. This is just another way to illustrate the relationship between these risks and the operations of a facility, the financial impacts. So on the left, we have the risks, and I mentioned before the transition risks and the physical risks. There are, you know, these different categories that, for instance, the SEC and others use to structure that kind of assessment. And then it's important to also evaluate the potential positive implications. There are opportunities that come out of climate change, and these are the general categories that are used to kind of capture those. For instance, renewable natural gas from landfill gas operations as an energy source is a huge bonus for facilities that can develop that resource. So that's an opportunity. Unfortunately, the increased occurrence of extreme storms and events that require cleanup has an opportunity for facilities that can help clean up those events and the damage done by them. So there's a market demand for increased service. But all that goes into this strategic planning model, and then companies are obliged to essentially try to put a number on some of these assessments to help, like I said earlier, their shareholders and stakeholders understand what the implications are from a positive or negative perspective.
Thanks for that. So, and so, you know, we're talking about risks. You just mentioned some opportunities associated with those risks, but, you know, why should we be evaluating these risks at all? You know, what is the advantage for companies, organizations to be looking at these sorts of things?
Yeah. Well, I guess one simple answer is that, you know, it makes good business sense to understand the risks and opportunities, and climate change has introduced a new set of risks and opportunities. So if companies aren't looking at that, they're not doing their organization or their shareholders, you know, the full service of being strategic and anticipating what's coming in the future. This illustration is just one simple approach to a qualitative assessment of some of these hazards. So you have three hazards on the left. Flooding, you know, you could think of coastal, like a chronic impact from sea level rise, or you could think of more acute events like extreme storms and inland flooding, riverine basin flooding, and so on. Carbon pricing, that's a transition risk associated with society deciding that, you know, putting a price on carbon like is done in the EU, where prices of carbon range anywhere from 40 to 100 euros per metric ton. And so, you know, businesses have to address that liability accordingly. And changes in market demand, as I mentioned earlier, societal pressure or decisions not to buy this or that. So those are the impacts in the middle, potential impacts, and then organization would assess. This is just a simple way to say, well, high, medium, or low, and what the combined risk then would be from, say, a low and a high gives you a low maybe, or a high and a medium gives you a medium, and two highs certainly give you a high, as a way to kind of characterize the potential. And normally these are done in different time frames, so maybe a near term, mid-term, and long-term time planning horizon. Usually for the long term, we're not looking out more than about 30 years, which is the typical life expectancy of a facility. But, you know, some of our planning right now, well, you hear, you know, net zero by 2050. So, you know, 30 years out is kind of common for a longer term.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are lots of reasons. There's a good reason. I just kind of to put it in people's face that, you know, what we're experiencing isn't normal. It's becoming normal, unfortunately, but if you compare the changes in temperature over time from an average, which is generally taken as a pre-20th century average, and you can find this information on the NASA website. I'll just Google the title here: Global Surface Temperature Departure from Average and NASA, and you'll find this information and a wealth of other similar data. But what were some of the statistics here? I had like the 2022 was the 6th warmest year since records started in 1880. And we've had the 10 warmest years all since 2010. Just a couple statistics. So, you know, that extreme surface temperature driving all kinds of other potential risks and impacts kind of related to the things we've talked about already. So.
Yeah, that's definitely a pretty clear visual of, you know, here's a big risk that's the industry is facing. So, and then having talked about the risks and some of the different ways to model it, Annette, my question to you is, what are you all doing kind of on the ground working towards managing these different risks?
Yeah, so I wanted to start off with my first kind of discussion just at a city level. We've been working on climate action planning for a while, so this is not just within the solid waste management kind of area of the city, but broader. Definitely having council support, to set those long-term low carbon goals in the way that the city operates and the city provides its services. In the original report to TransformTO was modeled that Toronto's greenhouse gas emissions had about 7% that were coming from waste specifically. That was mainly from open and closed landfills. So that didn't really take into account, the rest of our operation, but definitely you can see there's a significant amount from the waste sector specifically. More recently, in 2019, Council declared a climate emergency and worked to have even more ambitious plans, and then recently adopted the NetZero strategy. So specific outcomes there are, long-term planning that includes a large focus on decreased consumption and waste reduction. So working on single-use and takeaway policies and increased organics diversion from households and making sure that we have good participation in our programs. If you could slip to the next slide. Also, we're working, making sure that we're having conversations with other levels of government. So the federal government of Canada is actually working on potentially putting forward future regulations to reduce methane emissions from landfills specifically. They have some quotes there in their reports that you can see at the link below that basically kind of quantify methane emissions from municipal landfills. So they have a couple of different objectives that they're trying to achieve, and some of it is increased landfill monitoring, emissions landfill monitoring, so using drones and things like that to better quantify the levels of emissions coming from landfills. But you'll see in objective number 3 there that there's that direct connection to what municipalities can do in having organics programs, so making sure that we're reducing the amount of any kind of biodegradable waste that goes into landfills so that not as much methane is produced. So and to the next slide. I thought I'd just touch upon as well, what that looks like in terms of a closed loop system. So, in terms of programs and services that the city provides, I mentioned already this green bin organics program that we have for collection. And we now have a closed loop system where, the organic material that's collected at the curb is collected in vehicles that are running on compressed natural gas. That material is taken to our anaerobic digestion facilities where that gas is created, cleaned, injected into the natural gas pipeline, and we're able to then draw from that gas to fuel our vehicles or heat buildings and city buildings. So kind of having a carbon offset by using that waste as a resource, and all of that is able to for the most part, happen locally as well. So that would decrease any kind of transportation reliance on fossil fuels for that transportation. So here we're creating a renewable natural gas. Again, this is pretty common in also cleaning up gas from landfills and creating RNG, but this is one of our kind of flagship programs that we can really share with our residents that also helps them participate in the program because they feel like they're doing their piece of climate action as well as participating in the organics program. So I think a lot of people get overwhelmed and not knowing what they can do to kind of, help reduce climate change or slow down the impacts of climate change. So this is one of our programs that, provides an example of the circular economy and also that direct climate impact. And if you could just go to the next slide. So again, we have a renewable natural gas strategy. Again, we provide that gas into the overall natural gas pipeline. We don't own the pipeline, it belongs to Enbridge Gas. And then we take out that gas. And we're also allowing that kind of credit of those gas units to be used by other city divisions and agencies as well. So we're able to kind of purchase green fuels, so to speak, and kind of shift away from fossilized fuels. So pretty cool program that we have that we're really proud of as a city. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't, again, just try to plug waste reduction. So again, we have a lot of campaigns focusing on food waste reduction. So again, if we reduce it up front, then it doesn't need to be managed. And then there's all of those spill-off benefits from, no longer having to use fertilizers to create the food and all of that kind of stuff that happens even outside of the borders of Toronto, obviously, because we import a lot of our food. So yeah.
Wow. Well, that's quite a lot that you all are doing to manage the risk. And and thinking about it, so Chris had mentioned one of these, and even you just describing some of your programs, one question I had was, we're talking a lot about risk, but are there opportunities associated with climate change? And it almost sounds like, you and the city of Toronto have taken a lot of those risks and turned them into opportunities. And Chris, I don't know if you have other opportunities that you could speak to. What do you both think about potential opportunities coming out of climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, right, the renewable natural gas is a huge one. Another thing that we're seeing a lot from some of our landfill clients is the interest in developing solar on closed landfill cells. So it's big open expanse, and the technology exists to install ballasted solar panels, so they don't have to penetrate the liner. We have been successful in working through any modifications to solid waste permitting that may be needed, but that's been a big part of an energy supplemental solution for the industry. What other opportunities? I mean, I did do some review of a number of different disclosure statements by major solid waste corporations, and like I said earlier, unfortunately, with the increased occurrence of extreme storm events, there will be an increased demand for first responder type of support in the wake of severe storm events, whether at any time of the year. And so being able to provide that kind of service in response to increased demand, has a benefit to an organization from the bottom line, even though it's recognized that it's a sad situation, and you're having to. But obviously, somebody needs to help folks out, and municipalities and so on, and be available there to take to help out in those events. So, and some organizations are also looking at diversifying their service portfolios to address different technologies. I mean, the anaerobic decomposition and so on is one example, but different recycling or sorting and removal, making a better use from a circular economy perspective of waste than we have in the past. And so I think that that's seen as a potential opportunity. And then I guess organizations are also seeing, from an opportunity perspective, the potential for enhancement of their reputation as being part of the solution to a waste-related industrial kind of societal change, helping with the circular economy and helping with recycling and so on.
Annette, are there any other opportunities that you would like to add outside of kind of the things that you've already talked about?
No, I think I'll just plug the one that Chris really had, is that there's an economic opportunity with offering organics collection. And again, we have proven technology now in different types of weather conditions, you know, as an example in a very large major city. So I think that, you know, I totally echo a lot of Chris's opportunity there on like the business expansion and industry expansion. A couple other things, I think, you know, we often come together as an industry and share different operational knowledge on things, and I think that we can use maybe climate as a catalyst to bring together, you know, again, shared information on mitigation and response strategies that we might have in place, depending on, you know, what we've had to respond to date and what's worked and what hasn't, and maybe there's opportunities there on capturing some of that missed material that might have had to be landfilled because of those kind of more incident reactive related responses. And I think as industry professionals, there's probably an opportunity as well for us to build our capacity in climate kind of impact accounting. So that's not really an area that I'm an expert on, but it's now something that I need to know more about and the impact of all of my operations or the operations in the city of Toronto. So I think that there's an opportunity there for those kind of worlds to share a little bit more information and get more research done specifically on as it relates to solid waste and the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, definitely. It's a big opportunity in a sense for the industry as a whole. Well, and so this is kind of the last thing that I wanted to pose to you both before we dive into some audience questions of just, you know, thinking ahead. What are the biggest factors that you see impacting communities or companies kind of in the next decade as it relates to climate change impacts, climate change risks, climate change opportunities?
So I guess I'll start with that one. I think, you know, I think we're going to have to see climate related requirements or kind of scoping requirements in some of our operational contracts going forward. So there might be, you know, a requirement to have some disclosure reporting depending on the regulatory environment you might be at. So whether you provide that service in-house or whether you contract it out. So if businesses aren't familiar with that, again, they probably need to be prepared, because if there's regulations or compliance related things that require disclosure of carbon accounting in any way, then that will need to be done. So typically that hasn't been part of our scoping requirements and collection contracts or processing contracts and things like that. I also think, you know, again, just opportunities for being part of the solution a little bit more and maybe bring forward some of the more innovative projects that might be going on would be really interesting to hear. And I look forward to hearing about those from EREF and other industry organizations.
Yeah, I would echo those same topics as what Annette said. Also, I guess in the next 10 years, I would expect that there will be a reduction in the waste stream that consumers are generating, and industry for that matter. And so, and wiser use of materials with some, you know, sorting and so on. Heck, my daughter lives in overseas and in Switzerland, and we visited recently and had the opportunity to see how they sort waste, and it's completely different than what's required in Pittsburgh, where I live. You know, we have a one bin for all the municipal garbage and one for recyclables. Of course, they don't take glass around here anymore, so it's just metal and paper. But it's much more sophisticated overseas, and heck, even in this country, in California, you know, there's new composting requirements. So I think that we're going to continue to see that kind of evolution in expectations about how consumers and you know, facilities manage and sort and handle their waste, and an overall reduction over time. Certainly an increase in the use of renewable natural gas and so on from existing landfills, as the decomposition allows for the collection of that as a way to mitigate the potential cost implications of a price on carbon. And since I'm thinking about that at the moment, maybe I'll go into that one question that came in ahead of time to you, Suzie, if that's okay. Sure. Where someone was asking, well, what's the liability exposure for the waste industry for methane emissions from landfills. And so I have a number I came up with, $5 million per year as a round number for facilities. And I'll tell you how I got there. So, and this is in the US. So there's like 6 billion metric tons of CO2e, that's carbon dioxide equivalents emitted per year. And about 12% of that is associated with methane. So that's like 0.7 billion metric tons. 15% of that is from landfills. So round numbers, you get about 100 million metric tons from landfills. And in the US, there are about 1,100 facilities. So just divided by 1,000, you get about 100,000 metric tons per year of CO2e per facility. And I can't remember the guy's name, but he got the Nobel Prize for economics by recommending a price on carbon just a couple of years ago. And his number was about $50 per ton. And, you know, I think in our nascent greenhouse carbon market, it doesn't really exist in the States, but I've seen numbers toss out around $3 a ton for offsets and so on, compared to the, you know, whatever I said earlier, 80 euros or something overseas. But anyway, if you use 50 tons, $50 per ton, you come up with about $5 million per facility per year. So that's one way to look at the potential risk associated with a carbon price for facilities and the incentive to, you know, capture that valuable resource and monetize it and treat it accordingly.
Interesting to get that dollar value. Well, so, and people on the webinar, please, we're gonna start the Q&A portion. So if you have questions, please add those to the chat. And we'll kind of start fielding those questions as they come in. Chris already answered the one that we got in advance of the webinar. Kind of another a question we got in earlier is, what are the measures that have been put in place to curb the issues of solid waste when it comes to climate change? Annette, do you have any thoughts kind of on that? You know, what measures have put in place?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think I kind of mentioned, you know, some of the programs, you know, helping to reduce the amount of organics going to landfill, effectively managing landfill gas so that methane is destroyed and doesn't enter the atmosphere. Definitely a focus on waste reduction, but I think there's, you know, probably a lot more opportunities. It's just some of those actions are some of the ones that we've taken early on. We've also at the city, well, maybe not recently, but a couple of years ago now, have started looking at what a circular economy means for the city as well, and you know, only the future will tell how best the circular economy and climate kind of work intersect. But we've undertaken a circular economy baselining study that kind of attempted to model the material flows and streams that kind of make its way through the city, not just city managed, but also by industry in the city. And we're looking at developing a circular economy roadmap for the city to see how we can engage in the future different industry sectors to kind of make the city's kind of operation as a whole, maybe not operation, but being more circular. So whatever those industries are in the city, you know, so not only the ones that the city does as service provision, but anybody that's located in the city as well. So we're really excited about that upcoming work.
Yeah. So one other question that came in for you, thinking about the organics program, and the question is, you know, what is the feedback from the operating landfills, particularly as it relates to loss of revenue from decrease of organics?
There's no issue on our end. We own our own landfill, so it's actually in our benefit to, you know, make sure that we have capacity for as long as possible. So we are working to increase as much as we can greater organics capture. Our current landfill has about 10 to 12 years left. So, you know, we definitely want to extend the life of that landfill because it's one of our most costly assets that we have right now, and we want to make sure that we're maintaining the capacity for as long as we can. In terms of private sector landfill capacity, I can't really speak to that because we don't really use that much private sector landfill capacity. But in the province of Ontario anyways, it's actually, there's not a lot of landfill capacity remaining. So I think everyone kind of welcomes increased organics diversion. And at a province of Ontario regulatory standpoint, there's also what we call a food and organics waste policy statement. So different actors that manage waste have different targets that they need to aspire to reach as part of that framework as well. So it's kind of a direction that the province on a whole wants to go in increasing organics diversion from landfill.
Yeah, I mean, if I recall correctly from the report that EREF did looking at organics management across the country of Canada, but also looking at Ontario provinces specifically, I believe that a lot of the waste from Ontario is currently being exported elsewhere. Therefore, having organics programs is a real benefit to folks there.
Yeah, I think the last landfill report that was done by Waste Resource Ontario, formerly known as the Ontario Waste Management Association, I think it estimated about 30 to 40% of all waste generated in Ontario is being exported to the US.
Mm-hmm. So here's a different question, a little bit different direction. I think this might be sort of directed towards you, Chris, but Annette, feel free to chime in. The question is, how much work has been done on the cumulative effect of simultaneous hazards? For example, dampening or amplifying effect?
I guess the simple answer is probably not enough. I think that, well, I have some historic experience with human health risk assessment. And the problem, and this was 20 years ago or more, maybe even 40 years ago, where we were doing a lot of assessments associated with air impacts, inhalation risks from Superfund sites and site cleanups. And EPA's risk models were really limited to looking at one chemical at a time and not the synergistic impacts of multiple exposures. It just wasn't part of the science. And I think the same kind of constraint applies now, in that we're getting a handle on how to look at individual hazards, whether it's sea level rise or what happens if a 1 in 1,000 year downpour event happens. Well, what if 5 1 in 1,000 year events happen within a 30-day span, like happened in 2022? So we're getting increased frequencies of extreme events, and we're able to at least project, well, okay, if the flood, the water level rises above or outside the banks, and this area will be flooded, and what could we do to protect structures and infrastructure and so on. And we actually did a project like that not too long ago, where we designed a levee to protect a facility from being flooded because it was wiped out from a extreme storm event, and the insurance company wouldn't reinsure the facility without there being protection from another future event. So, that sort of characterization is necessary, and but looking at the compounded effects gets to that other model that I shared earlier. And there's a lot of work being done on what are the aggregate or cascading effects of multiple hazards occurring in the same time frame, and how do we try to characterize that? So it's really an emerging area, I think.
So here's another interesting one that I thought just came in. So could either of you share some thoughts on some of the indirect or secondary impacts of climate change on the solid waste industry? Changes or expansions in certain waste stream components, For example, as we shift energy components away from fossil fuels, that would be, I think, one example. They also mentioned that they're specifically thinking about electrical vehicle batteries.
I think that one I'll just mention, in Ontario, we do have a lot of extended producer responsibility programs. So I think that's something that, car vehicle batteries are not currently covered under legislation. So I think that's something that's going to have to be looked at in the future as we shift more to electric powered vehicles. And also I've started reading a couple of articles, I think, on the startup of electric vehicle battery recycling. So I think that that's something that also needs to happen. The rare metals that are required for the electric vehicle batteries are going to be in short supply really fast. So if we can't find a way to recirculate them into use again, that will be kind of an indirect impact of a good intentions and unintended consequences if there's a resource supply there. So I think that's an indirect opportunity. So I think, again, just cycling back to the concepts of circular economy, I think anything that, are good ideas, need to have the full life cycle of thought behind them, that, when we're designing a material, how can we make it useful for as long as possible? How can it be repaired? And then what's its kind of downstream opportunities before any kind of final disposal, right? So I think that we'll probably see more of that, because the other issues with climate can be, Chris had mentioned on a call the other day that access to facilities might be impacted by extreme weather events too. So that's looking at it from a waste perspective, but if you're looking at it from a other kind of goods and supplies kind of perspective, then we might not be able to get access to certain materials or resources that we need to run our economy. So if we're able to again make kind of our product loops a little bit more local, through some of this work, and that's related to climate, then we get the waste related benefit and waste reduction, but we also get a little bit of resiliency as well.
Yeah, and to build on Annette's point about EV batteries and the waste stream, same goes for wind turbine blades. I think most people have seen pictures of turbine blades in landfills. That's not a great thing. And solar panels, many of which already are being disposed of and replaced with more efficient versions. And so there's most of what you read about sustainability and ESG, encourages people to look at their organizations, their systems through the ESG lens, right? And look for opportunities. And just like Annette said, there are lots of opportunities in the marketplace for entrepreneurs who can, dial in a very efficient and competitive way to recycle solar panels. And keep them out of the waste stream, but and make that into a circular business model too. So I think we're going to see more and more of that.
Yeah, so where there is change, there is opportunity, it seems like, and climate change really could be a big opportunity for the solid waste industry. Absolutely. So I thank you guys for participating. We're at time, so I'm going to wrap things up. This concludes EREF's science session, exploring the impacts of climate change on the solid waste industry. Thank you, Chris and Annette, so much for your time and expertise and for participating today. As a reminder to those on the webinar, you'll receive an email from EREF through GoToWebinar, and please take a moment to complete the brief survey, and then you'll be able to download your certificate. We appreciate your feedback to help us improve these science sessions. Thank you again so much for your participation. I hope everyone has a great day.